All right, so again, hello and welcome to today's presentation hosted by the Data Feminism Network. My name is Annika and I'm the Vice President of the Data Feminism Network, or DFN. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that the members of the Data Feminism Network live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I'd also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Our speaker today is the Data Feminism Network's founder and current president, Ali Dunn. Ali is a data analyst and storyteller with more than 3 years of experience using statistical analysis to promote components of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. She's currently working as an international consultant for the United Nations Development Program, while simultaneously completing a Master's of Business Analytics at the University of British Columbia. She's passionate about leveraging data for gender equality and has worked for organizations like One Girl Can, the Gift Foundation, and as a personal intern to the senior consultant at UN Women. Today, she will be introducing us to the topic of gender data. The presentation will last approximately 20 minutes, and we ask you to please hold your questions until the end. We also encourage you to use the raise hand function or the chat function at that time. Members of the DFN community will be monitoring those as well. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ali Dunn.
Thank you, Annika, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I just want to confirm everyone can hear me and see my screen okay? Okay, awesome. So before getting started, I do want to clarify that although I do have experience in the field of gender data, I am by no means an expert. This is just a topic that I've been very interested in for the past couple years, hence the idea behind founding the Data Feminism Network. And this presentation is more or less an example of my learning publicly, so I hope you enjoy nonetheless. So I'll just start by walking you through a quick overview of what we'll be talking about today. First, I'm going to start by defining what is data, then jump into defining gender data more specifically. We'll discuss why it matters, and then I'll walk you through a few examples of what happens when gender data isn't accounted for. So when we say data, what exactly are we talking about? I'm going to ask all of you to throw into the chat whatever word or words comes to mind when you hear the word data. I see information, statistics, numbers, power, knowledge. All right, yeah, thank you for all doing that. So when we think of data, we tend to think of numbers, which is correct, but this subconscious way of thinking can be dangerous. We think of numbers as something objective, and similarly, the word data is often used to represent evidence or fact. But in reality, our data isn't always objective. It's shaped by so many things. For example, how is our data being collected? Who is collecting our data? And what kind of questions are being asked to get a hold of this data? All of these things will shape the types of responses you get. So there's a famous example of labor force participation rates where, depending on how you ask the question of women, labor force participation will go up or down. Now, in reality, participation isn't actually going up or down, but depending on how you ask the question, your data will be more or less accurate. So this idea that data isn't something completely objective and acknowledging all the different aspects that influence the validity and accuracy of your data is important to keep in mind, and something we'll dive deeper into during this presentation. So coming back to our question, what is data? Well, data can really be anything. It can be words, it can be emotions, anything that has been systematically collected can be considered data. So what is gender data? Well, Data2X, an organization under the umbrella of the United Nations, defines 3 key aspects of gender data. Put simply, gender data is sex disaggregated data, meaning any data set that classifies a respondent's gender can be considered gender data. Secondly, gender data reflects gender issues, questions, problems, and concerns related to all aspects of women's and men's lives, including their specific needs, opportunities, and contributions to society. The third key aspect of gender data is unbiased collection. So this refers to what we just talked about, how there are lots of factors that shape and influence your data. When we're talking about gender data more specifically, we need to take into account stereotypes and cultural factors that may induce gender bias in the data. So for example, let's say we're interviewing a woman about her experience with domestic violence. If we're doing that, we probably shouldn't have her husband present. If her husband is present, or even in the other room, this will likely affect her responses and induce bias in the data. So why does this matter? Why am I sitting here today talking to you about gender data? Well, if you think about it, our whole world runs on data. Every decision we make, from our personal lives to the corporate world to government, all of these decisions are based on data, which brings us to the topic of inclusive decision-making. The reality is, if our data isn't representative of the population that a decision is going to affect, this decision is likely not going to be what's best for everyone. So this is why gender data is really at the heart of inclusive decision-making, because if the needs of women and girls and other marginalized communities aren't reflected in the data, it's going to be nearly impossible for industry leaders and policymakers to make inclusive and effective decisions. Now, another key aspect of why gender data matters is something called algorithmic bias, which refers to creating exclusionary experiences and discriminatory practices. So, like human bias, algorithmic bias results in unfairness. However, algorithms, like viruses, can spread bias on a massive scale and at a rapid pace. And as frightening as it is to hear, research shows that algorithms aren't just reflecting our biases, but they're often amplifying them. With this information in mind, we as decision makers need to take a step back and ask ourselves the question, who is this data representing? The consequences of failing to ask this question can range from annoying to rip your hair out frustrating to fatal. So allow me to walk you through a few examples. We're all familiar with facial recognition technology. When taking pictures on our phones, we see that little square appear around our faces. And similarly, when tagging friends in photos on Facebook, we see the same square appear around their faces. Let me introduce you to Joy Bulamwini, an African-American computer scientist who experienced the bias of facial recognition firsthand. When she was an undergraduate student, she discovered facial recognition programs would work well on her white friends, but wouldn't recognize her face at all. She figured it was a flaw that would surely be fixed before long, rather. However, a few years later, after joining the MIT Media Labs, she ran into the same problem again. Only when she put on a white face mask did the software recognize her face. Now, this software is able to accurately identify white men 99% of the time. However, even top-performing facial recognition systems misidentify Black faces at a rate 5 to 10 times higher than they do white faces. So this problem stems from the fact that algorithms are only as good as the data upon which they have been trained. So how this works is in creating a training set to train the algorithm on, you create this set with examples of images and you say, okay, this is a face, this is a face, this is not a face. And over time, you teach the computer to recognize faces. However, if the training set isn't really that diverse, any face that deviates too far from the norm is going to be more difficult to detect. Now, the good news is these training sets don't just appear out of nowhere. We as data scientists actually create them. So there's an opportunity here to create a full spectrum training set that reflects a richer and more diverse portrait of humanity. The catch is that we as data scientists need to be aware of these biases in order to address them. Now, I want to pause here for a second. Today, we're talking about gender data and how it relates to data feminism, but it's so important to understand that feminist thought isn't only about gender. What we call intersectional feminists, like Bulamwini here, have keyed us into how race, class, sexuality, age, ability, religion, geography, etc., all influence each person's experiences and opportunities in the world. in talking about gender data and asking ourselves, who is this data representing? Well, it's impossible to do that, and impossible to address gender issues without acknowledging and addressing these intersections. And Bulamwini's experience as a Black woman is a perfect example of that. So another example of algorithmic bias is a sexist recruiting tool developed by Amazon. As we all know, Amazon is one of the world's largest companies, and as a result, the company deals with an overwhelming amount of job applicants each year. In 2014, the company was trying to find an efficient and effective way to review these applications. What they decided to do is they created an algorithm to do a first-pass filter of applicants based on the resumes of existing employees, which sounds like a relatively good idea, right? I mean, employees were hired for a reason. However, they almost immediately had to scrap the idea because they soon discovered that the algorithm wasn't rating candidates in a gender-neutral way. So how the system worked is it did a kind of regression analysis to figure out what factors are correlated to resumes that should be immediately dismissed. And what they found, among other things, is if a woman attended a women's college, she was put into the immediately do not interview pile simply because Amazon's current employees didn't attend women's colleges because they were men. So it's this amplification that is particularly concerning and brings us back to the key point that the algorithms aren't just reflecting our biases, but they're often amplifying them by a significant amount. So in the last two examples, we looked at algorithmic bias, meaning the decisions were ultimately made by algorithms, albeit algorithms that were developed by humans, but algorithms nonetheless. In this third example, like many other real-world examples, it's humans who are making data-driven and research-based decisions. So we have a question on the screen here. Is bad data killing women? Now, I wouldn't be surprised if you were thinking, this is an exaggeration, you're just trying to catch our attention. And although I am trying to catch your attention, it is for good reason, because the answer to this question is yes. We have, the reason for this is that medicine has functioned on the assumption that male bodies can represent humanity as a whole. And as a result, we have a huge historical data gap when it comes to the female body. And this is a data gap that is continuing to grow as researchers carry on ignoring the pressing ethical need to include female cells, animals, and bodies in their research. Alongside insisting that sex differences don't matter, some research advocate against the inclusion of women in research on the basis that while biological sex may matter, the lack of comparable data arising from this historical data gap makes including women inadvisable. A perfect and frustrating example of adding insult to injury. So there's an unnervingly common phenomenon known as Yentl syndrome, whereby women are misdiagnosed and poorly treated if their symptoms and diseases do not conform to those of men. For example, a heart attack may present itself differently in a woman and a man. So as a result, women must navigate this obstacle course of male bias treatment. Inevitably, the consequences of this lack of data can be fatal. So now that I've explained why gender data matters and walked you through some fairly disheartening examples, you're probably wondering, what do I do with this? What can I do? How can I be better? Or at least I hope that's something you're thinking. Well, we know that inclusive decision-making and algorithmic bias are at the heart of why gender data matters. With this in mind, we as decision makers have a moral obligation to A, ensure our data is representative of everyone within the population that a decision is going to affect, and B, better understand our own biases so we can address them. We need to make sure systems are in place to help us address these biases and underrepresentations. And we've talked about some of these systems and tools that we can use. So let's open up our little toolbox here. Firstly, asking yourself the simple question, who is this data representing, is an essential tool and a great first step. The use of gender data is, of course, essential to making sure marginalized communities are represented in the data upon which decisions are being made. And the third tool in our toolbox, diverse representation isn't something I've explicitly highlighted, but it's been a common theme throughout the presentation. For example, if Black women were involved in developing the training sets upon which facial recognition software was being trained, they're much more likely to recognize that people who look like themselves are missing from the data. Similarly, with Amazon's recruiting tool, women are more likely to be aware of the fact that Amazon at the time was a very male-dominated space and potentially see the issues with that. All right, so now that we have this overview of our toolbox, let's go over a high-level recap. We know that data isn't always objective, but rather it's shaped by factors such as who's collecting it, how it's being collected, and what kind of questions are being asked to collect the data. We learned gender data is at the heart of inclusive decision-making and addressing algorithmic bias. And we know that algorithms aren't just reflecting our biases, but they're amplifying them, often by a significant amount. And we as decision makers have a moral obligation to better understand our biases and make sure systems are in place to help us identify them. We now have our starter toolbox to do that. Now let's remember from Bulamwini that feminist thought isn't only about gender, and when talking about gender data, we need to acknowledge the intersectionalities that come along with it. And lastly, as data-driven decision-making continues to shape our world, I hope this presentation has shown you the value and necessity of gender data and illustrated how feminist thinking in this way is at the root of a more just and equitable society. So that concludes my presentation for today. I would like to open up the floor to any questions. Please feel free to either use the raise hand function or the chat function.
All right, everybody, I'll be monitoring both the participant list and the chat function. So please feel free and go ahead and ask any questions. I'll be going in order for the participants who've raised their hands. And if you feel like you're not comfortable speaking out, then feel free to write down your questions on the chat as well. So we just got a question over chat, Ali, and the question is, are there any examples of gender data gaps at a university level that you can think of?
That's a great question, Jade. I think that universities are definitely becoming increasingly aware from like a recruiting perspective, recruiting students perspective. I'm not sure if that's what you're asking, but they're definitely becoming increasingly aware of making sure that their student population is diverse, and they're reaching out to marginalized communities to ensure that diversity. So, you know, when you're filling out your application, you do include information pertaining to gender and race and other factors that may influence your individual experiences and opportunities in the world. So in that way, I think that universities are doing a good job of addressing those gaps and collecting that information. But something to keep in mind, and something that comes to mind from my personal experience as a master's student, Master's of Business Analytics student at UBC. I mean, the program is amazing, and I'm only partway through, so maybe there'll be more of this later, but it's interesting that, at least from what I can see coming up, there aren't any courses that are taught specifically on data bias. And though it might be covered partially in other courses, it's kind of shocking to me that there aren't courses that focus specifically on this topic when, you know, it is something so important. And we as data analysts, data scientists who come out of this program are going to be shaping our world in this way. So in terms of where universities can improve, I think in courses that focus specifically on data, or in programs rather that focus specifically on data, having a course or at least some workshops pertaining to this subject is something that they could definitely improve on.
We have another question in the chat from Melissa, and the question is, how did the DFN start?
Hi, Melissa. That is a great question. Yeah, so as I mentioned, this is a subject that I've been interested in for the past couple years now. I have a background in business analytics going back to my undergrad. And shortly after my undergrad, I went on a trip to India. That's where my passion for gender inequality started. And I started thinking about, how can I combine this passion for gender inequality with analytics? I didn't realize, it was a thing. I didn't realize gender data was a thing, but the more research I did, the more I learned, and the more I got excited about it. So when starting my master's program, I was looking for a way to bring this topic to my cohort, firstly, and connect with people who have similar passions. So I actually met Annika near the beginning, right before the beginning of our program. And I found out that she was reading a book called Invisible Women, which is actually the book of the month in our book club this week. It's a great book about exposing data bias in a world designed for men. So we started talking about this topic of gender data, and we decided, we should do something with this. We should start some sort of organization to get this conversation started. And I was actually talking with a woman who works at Data 2X, which is the organization I mentioned in my presentation that focuses on mobilizing action for gender data. And I asked her what kind of problems her organization was facing. And she said that as a organization that focuses on advocacy for women and girls in the realm of gender data, a problem that they face is getting the conversation beyond, governments and organizations who focus on this, but getting it out to the general public so that the knowledge of this topic is broadened. So Data Feminism Network was kind of a way to not only connect with my cohort and increase their understanding, but kind of just spread the word of the importance of gender data.
We also have another question from Whitney. Whitney, please go ahead.
Thanks, Annika, and thanks, Allie. Great presentation. And I think one of the things I was so glad that you talked about was the piece about intersectionality, because, as a person that identifies as a woman, I am, of course, always thinking about, interests that are near and dear to my heart, but I also want to think about like those people that are not always represented, like, for example, transgendered people, and how often we see these binary options on surveys where there's only a male and a female option, yet there are people that don't identify with either of those. And even with race, I recently saw a survey where you had to put your first and last name, and they required at least 3 characters for the last name, which eliminated this particular individual with the last name YU, which is a very, very common last name for a large portion of people, and was, a racist form of collecting this data. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are about, extending this beyond kind of like female issues in particular, but also like what we can do to, I guess, advocate for these other groups of people that are also maybe being disenfranchised.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Whitney. That's a great question. So intersectionality is a topic that I've only just started to scrape the surface of. And from a data perspective, it's extremely complicated, especially when it comes to even just like the topic of gender. When you're asking about someone's gender, you want to make sure that all of those other genders besides just male and female are represented in your data. But finding those groups, since they are considered like a minority group, finding those groups to make sure they're accurately represented poses a challenge in and of itself. And there are so many other aspects of intersectionality that are really difficult to capture in data. So the thing that people need to remember, that data scientists and like people who design these surveys, people who collect this data, a lot of thought just needs to be put into framing those questions, asking yourselves, what kind of questions need to be asked to make sure we get a clear understanding of who these people are and all the intersectionalities that affect their opportunities and experiences in the world. So putting a lot of thought in that collection process is going to be key to addressing those issues. And like I said, this is something that I'm only just scraping the surface of. And within the Data Feminism Network, we actually have a gender and inclusivity lead. She's here today. Her name's Jade. So she is kind of teaching us more about inclusivity and the history of data feminism. And we're hoping in the future, she will be either hosting a presentation herself, or the team at DFN will be putting a presentation together about that topic specifically and how it relates to gender data.
Awesome. Thanks so much. I think I would love to hear a topic on that. So I hope you will do that. And I would definitely share that with some people, because I know diversity and inclusion is a hot topic these days. And hopefully we can capitalize on that momentum and get more people involved.
Is there anything else in the chat there, Annika?
No, I don't think so. I don't think anybody has their hands raised either.
All right, awesome. Well, we actually only have 5 minutes left on the free 40-minute Zoom meeting anyway, so this timing works out well. Thank you all for attending today. If this is a subject that you're interested in and you're interested in getting more involved or just staying up to date, please follow Data Feminism Network's social media pages. We have a Facebook and LinkedIn page with a website coming soon. And if you're looking for more ways to get involved, there's information on those pages, but first thing that comes to mind is we have a book club. Like I mentioned, we're reading Invisible Women, Exposing Data Bias in a World Designed for Men at the moment. And there'll be a book club meeting at the end of the month where we're talking about that, which is a great opportunity to learn from your fellow data feminists. And we're also going to be having some guests on what we're calling the DFN Lounge. So we have a employee at Data2X who we'll be having a conversation with, and some employees from some other organizations in the big leads of gender data. So stay tuned for that. And thank you again for all attending today.